Hello everyone, this is Grandmaster Friedel, and today I'm doing the second episode of my series, Autopsy. So today I wanted to continue the theme of, going over a game of a super tournament. It's not always going to be that way, but that's the way I want to start with it. And last time I did a game between Carlsen and Aronian, where Carlsen won very decisively as white, and I showed what went wrong for Black's perspective from Aronian. And if you guys haven't checked out that video, I encourage you to do so. And for this one, I'm actually going to show a game in a later round, in round 6, where Carlsen actually lost. And Carlsen was black in this game against GM Wesley So. And I want to go over what went wrong, how did he lose. Again, not so much focusing on specific mistakes necessarily, but what were the game-changing moments? Where did things go from bad to worse? What decisions really led him to defeat? And obviously, the world champion and highest-rated player does not lose very often. So it's usually something a bit subtle and, little things that kind of lead the way. And his opponent, in this case, also played an excellent game. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, if at all possible. Notice how I'm sharing the blame with the viewers. It's a common theme you'll find. So d4, d5 was played, c4, c6. So this seems like kind of an early moment, but basically, usually Magnus likes knight f6, e6 setups. So Slav he certainly played, but it was a little bit unexpected in this game. Wesley actually said after the game that this was a surprise, which is why he took on d5. And I just wanted to highlight this moment because it's very common in GM chess, not just at this level, but even with lower rated GMs, where basically if you're surprised in the opening, you usually don't play like your sharpest main line, you usually veer and play something slightly quieter. And it doesn't mean that he was by any means playing for a draw, it just means that he was trying to take it easy, trying to play it safe. So black recaptured with the pawn, which is customary, bishop f4. Knight f6, knight c3, knight c6. And white decided to play knight f3. e3 is the main alternative, which is completely different system for the most part. But knight f3, of course, is also logical. And here, Magnus decided to go with the a6 system. I would say more people these days are playing into the main line, which would go bishop f5, e3, e6. Bishop b5, and then the key move is knight d7. And very sharp, very interesting. Magnus decided to go with a6, which is also logical, just keeping this knight out. Rook c1, very common nuance. The rook is useful on c1, and the whole idea is that if you play e3, it's considered slightly inaccurate because this bishop can go to g4, pinning the knight, followed by e6, and black has a fairly easy game. So this is not considered dangerous. White plays rook c1, bishop f5, e3. Notice how now bishop g4, of course, would just lose the tempo. So now you wait until e3. Rook c8. This move basically aims to discourage queen b3 moves. After e6, queen b3, queen c2, not so much. Queen b3 is a pretty dangerous line, or at least, black has to be careful. So after rook c8, bishop e2. White doesn't really want to trade the bishops so hastily. This bishop on f5 looks nice, but oftentimes the bishop on e2 comes in handy if white tries to play on the queen side. e6, castles. And again, I think the normal move here is bishop d6, and okay, you trade the bishops. White maybe has a little something trying to get into c5, but it's fairly typical. Magnus decides to play a more combative move. Knight d7. Knight a4, bishop e7, and this was actually an important moment. It wasn't from Magnus's perspective necessarily. But here, most people would assume that white's move would be something like a3, which is a very typical exchange Slav move. However, here a3 is actually an inaccuracy. And let's see if you guys can figure out why. So after a3, if you'd like, take a pause and try to figure out why did he not play a3? Why not this building move? And if you guys are stuck, I can give you the hint that in the game h3 was played, which, at least to the casual observer, does not look like a very great move. Or at least, it wouldn't be like the first thing that comes to mind. It's not like knight h5 threatening the bishop is possible. But after a3, it turns out that black can go on the offensive and play g5 and h5. And all of a sudden, it's very awkward for white. g4 is coming, h4 is coming, and there's no real great option for white to deal with all these moves. This is a very common thing. It's not like white's in trouble, but all of a sudden, white has some difficult questions to answer. So that's why he played h3. And I'd say that this kind of subtle opening knowledge is what really separates people who truly know their openings from people who kind of dabble a little bit, or who know the basic ideas but don't know the details. Because things like this can really matter. Otherwise, a3 would have been a great move, because if black just castles and black plays with knight c5 and b4, white's probably just better. So h3 at least is a slight loss of a tempo. And the whole idea is that now if g5, you play bishop h2, and if h5, I forget, I did see the post-game press conference where he talked about the game, and I think he mentioned d2 was the move he was going to play. So, but this is the one I like best. And all of a sudden, g4, it looks dangerous, but you can really take this pawn. There's nothing horrible that's going to happen to you. Black can try to go berserk on you with this kind of thing, but I don't actually think that it's going to work. The queen can go back, king can go back, queen can come out to h4, and bishop back to h3, I believe. Maybe this is a little dangerous for his liking. Of course, it's not necessary to, you can take here if you need to, and this is quite safe with the bishop coming back to h3. I think after the game he said he was thinking of maybe taking, but bishop check looks at the very least quite annoying. So I'm not exactly sure if this is what he was going to go for, but okay, it doesn't really matter. The point is that this stuff doesn't quite work, and he knew it didn't work at the time. For this very reason. Because if black has to play a move like h4 and white plays knight b3 trying to come into c5, it's just really nice. And there's no attack at all now because the g4 square is covered. So again, it's these little nuances that really make the difference. So castles, a3 now, but notice how white's basically down a tempo because h3 serves no other purpose than to kind of discourage this one idea. So black plays knight a5, white plays knight c5, which is very typical. The idea is if you take twice, b4 is going to hit you, forking the pieces. So Magnus plays knight c4, and again, I'm going a little quickly, but I really want to focus on the decisions where things really went off. In this particular position, I would say that, if you talk to most of the elite GMs, they were surprised that Magnus chose this line, because according to them at least, white was slightly better in this line, whereas in a lot of lines of the exchange Slav, that's not the case. But I don't know. You can't really... I would say most games are not decided by an opening phase like that, and I think it really came down to decisions later. But there are times when an opening choice, even if it's not dubious, can kind of tilt the game in the wrong direction. And one of the things I did notice was that Wesley was playing much more quickly and confidently than Magnus here. Meaning that he had studied this line, knew exactly what to do, whereas Magnus had to figure things out. Now, that being said, of course, Magnus is perfectly capable of figuring out most positions. Same is true for most of these guys. But it always puts you at a slight advantage if you really know the ideas better. So, knight c4 was played. b4. Knight takes c5, pawn takes c5. And this is where things started going a bit awry. So, he played knight takes a3, which is a very natural looking move. But probably is the first error. Now, exactly how this happens is unclear to say. But I'm going to speculate. And again, this is pure speculation, and it's very possible that other things went wrong for him. But my guess would be, and I think this contributes to most of his mistakes this game, Magnus really did not want a one-sided position. What I mean by that is, from his point of view, he wants at least to have counter chances. He wants to have a position where things can go his way as well as his opponent's. And I think sometimes this desire can force us to play moves which are sometimes not the best. There are times when, especially in Exchange Slav, a really safe opening where sometimes, especially at the elite level, this is less true at lower levels, I would say, but at the elite level especially, sometimes you just have to accept a position where you're never going to win unless they blunder, essentially. And I think that black kind of had to do that here. Black could play b5, cementing this knight. And it's pretty annoying to get rid of this guy. I don't really see a great way to do it apart from taking on b6. Queen takes b6, knight e5. And a position like this looks quite okay. Black, maybe the best move is actually rook fd8, which is interesting. But even if knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. Okay, white's a little bit better on the queen side. Extremely safe. Nothing really is going to go wrong. So the likelihood of black ever winning this game, of course, is almost zero. But at the same time, how much is white really better here? I would say a little bit. I'd definitely take white, but nothing too severe. And after rook fd8, I would say things are very, very unclear, because it's hard to actually take this pawn here, because after pawn takes, you hit the queen. I don't know. I mean, it looks like at least a playable option for black. But he decided to take on a3 with the idea that he's not going to be able to keep his pawn, but when the knight slides back to c4, he's going to grab the two bishops. The problem, which you'll see, is that the two bishops are actually not that valuable here. So Wesley plays knight d4. Allowing knight takes bishop is really bad because it destroys your whole structure. The bishop will come out to f3 and chop every pawn on the board, most likely. So here Magnus had a slightly difficult choice. He could play bishop e4 or bishop g6. Bishop e4 has a drawback, which we'll come to later. But at first I liked bishop g6 better. But when I took a deeper look, the problem is that white can simply do what they did in the game. Grab this pawn. And black just doesn't really have that many great ideas. Bishop f6, rook fd1 is... black lost? Of course not. But it's just very difficult to play. All of white's pieces are very natural. There's not a whole lot you can do. And the fact is that I think already he was a little bit worse, so maybe this isn't any worse than what he did. But I don't think that you could call his move a mistake, because it definitely made the game a little more unclear, I thought. So bishop e4, f3, bishop g6, queen b3, knight c4. So he gets his bishop. But when you look at this position, you think, I don't know, are the two bishops really that valuable? This bishop doesn't look like a prize. This bishop is ready to be blocked off by e4, which is actually one of the main drawbacks of this play. So this was the first position I highlighted as really a key moment. Okay, he should have played b5 instead of knight takes a3. I mentioned that. But that's a more understandable error. This was a moment where I think that he really needed to start panicking. Now, panicking meaning the position's lost? Of course not. But I think that this was the moment where he had to be extremely precise with how he played. Because he played a move here which is certainly an understandable move. It tries to make the game a little bit unclear. It's kind of a cool move to play. But ultimately, I think it's just not the right approach. I think this was a moment where he had to buckle down and go, look, I don't have a good position. Life is not great, but I have to find a way to at least make it so that white can't develop any initiative, that white can't do anything to me that's too bad. And in this case, I think the best defense was actually bishop g5. And this is what Wesley mentioned after the game. Incidentally, if you guys haven't checked out the post-mortem analysis of a lot of those players, it's very interesting. So I encourage you to check out the interviews there. And Wesley in particular, I find, is very honest about what he saw, what he didn't see, what his attitude was during the game, and it really provides a lot of insights. And again, from his point of view, bishop g5 was just the only way to ever make counterplay. So bishop takes g5, queen takes g5. So white can consider moves like queen c3, but they're not so special probably. Most likely white's idea is to play e4, the idea being to shut out this bishop, which is certainly annoying. But okay, black plays rook d8, white plays rook d1. And now black doesn't have any great moves. E5 is way too loose, most likely. So let's say a move like h6. This is not a fun position. Black has this ridiculous looking bishop. I know it would make me sad too to have this bishop, and I can definitely feel his pain. But at the same time, that's really the only thing that's horribly wrong. Okay, white can play knight b3 to a5, but black can always drop the queen back to e7. Notice also how white's king's a little bit open, so moves like queen e3 check are at least annoying. They don't necessarily do much, but white always has to deal with them. And in the meantime, Black can slowly move the king, maybe try to play e5, f6 one day and get this bishop out. It's at least, black has at least a future here. And I don't think that black's position is very easy to crack, especially with these holes that you're dealing with, g3, f4, e3. Is white better? For sure. Is black ever going to win this game? I don't think so. But at this point, he really had to look for something which just was solid and kept things together. Because at the moment, life is pretty rough. And at the times you have to do this. He played the move queen e8, which kind of is a fun move to play. You're maybe threatening bishop takes c5, e5. It's sneaky. It covers the light squares. It gets out of stuff on the d file. It's one of those moves where it's very tempting to play a move like this. The problem is that it doesn't secure any counterplay. And again, I think he wanted counterplay. He wanted those two bishops. But the fact is that his position just becomes worse and worse until he's kind of wishing he had traded the bishops and kind of accepted that lesser evil. And there are times when you just have to go to a position where you're never going to win and just accept it. This is true at all levels, really. It's never a fun thing. It's something every player kind of hates to do. But it's sometimes necessary. And, okay, you could say that maybe he should have prepared better and gotten a better opening. But at the same time, everyone has to deal with worse positions. It happens all the time. And it's how you handle them that is extremely important. So queen e8 I thought was not quite precise. Here, white actually could have played c6, perhaps, which is a little counterintuitive. It's a move which a computer will spot right away, but which for a human is a little tricky because it's like, whoa, I'm releasing this bishop from its death. I'm, breaking up too many pawns. But the fact is that if a knight lands on c6, it's just going to be uber painful. It's not going to be a lot of fun. So this move would have been quite strong. And, okay. But he played bishop g3, which is an understandable move, getting out of this e5 idea. So, again, Magnus maybe could have played bishop g5, trying to eke out, but it's very difficult. It's not a pleasant position to have to play, so he plays e5 himself. And honestly, after this, his position is just completely untenable, because white simply plays knight back to b3, the knight's coming to a5, and honestly, he just doesn't have almost anything. And again, you're wondering, like, how did this happen? I mean, his position was worse, but it wasn't this bad. The fact is that it's very easy for a position to go from bad to extremely bad if you don't have a firm grip on what's going on right away. Again, that decision of not playing bishop g5 really is highlighted now, because he just has no good solution to any of his problems. The knight can come to a5, rook can come to d1, this pawn is hanging. Notice how you cannot play f6, which would solve all the problems. So what is there to do? There's just absolutely no great possibilities here. Again, maybe bishop g5 is possible, but even after just rook fe1, like, what exactly are you doing? So after this, there's really not that much he can do. I will come to a couple moments later, though. So after bishop d8, queen d5 is an excellent move by Wesley, targeting this pawn, centralizing the queen, hitting this pawn. So Magnus plays here, and he simply grabs this pawn. So at this point, I think pretty much losing. I don't want to say he can resign immediately, but life is not exactly grand. So for example, you'd love to take this pawn, but now after bishop d6 and c6, you have lots of problems. The pawn's going to land on d7, and if you play pawn takes pawn, I can simply take this queen and take this rook. So he basically played bishop e7, which is an understandable decision, and now he's simply down a pawn. So okay, when you're playing players of this level, oftentimes this means you're kind of dead. But let's go a little bit later. There were at least a couple moments where he could have tried something. So rook fd8, bishop d6. Very annoying. You never really want to take this guy. Bishop f6, e4, shutting down this bishop. h6, knight d4. And this is a moment I really like, because this knight d4 move is a very difficult, particularly for club players, to play, But I would also say that lesser GMs and slightly lower rated players would also have a problem with this move. And Wesley played it almost without hesitation. I'm not even saying whether it's the most accurate move or not. I'm honestly not sure. But the main thing I want to focus on is that he's completely unafraid of the opposite bishop position. So many players, when they see an opposite bishop position coming, they think that, oh my goodness, it's going to be so drawish. The fact is that this opposite bishop position is not even remotely drawish. And the reason is that there are still heavy pieces on the board. There's still attacking potential. And whenever there's attacking potential, opposite bishops usually help. But even disregarding that, there are so many situations where, okay, if you get an opposite bishop endgame where the rooks can be traded, the rooks have open lines, say, or it's just bishops, then yes, it usually becomes extremely drawish. But as long as there are heavies on the board, as long as the rooks are shut down and you have ways to build, even in an endgame, it's going to be so difficult to draw. But of course here, White has absolutely no intention of going to the endgame. But the main part, and I'm sure Magnus understood this too, this was certainly not a mistake of his, but I just wanted to mention it because a lot of students I know sometimes have this issue where they just don't want to allow opposite bishop endgame when they're up a pawn. But in this particular case, opposite bishops actually make life easier, not harder. So black does indeed take this knight, which would have been very strong otherwise. Rook e8, trying to stop the pawns from running, otherwise f4, f5 is potentially annoying. And white just plays rook e1, king h7, and g4. So g4 might surprise some of you, but the whole point is black can't ever get to this king. These rooks are extremely passive, and white just wants to shove these pawns down black's throat. So f6, f4. And this is one of the last couple moments I wanted to look at. There are definitely a few moments where I thought it was important and which maybe he could have played more accurately, but I have a feeling that this position, and I mean, you'd have to ask the man himself, but part of defending positions like this is having sort of the right attitude. And again, I'm certainly not going to say that he had the wrong attitude here. I'm in no position to know that, but I know that if I were black here, I would be thinking, man, this is depressing. His pawns are coming at me, I'm probably going to get checkmated, I'm down a pawn with no counterplay. Well, life is not exactly great. But if I were doing better, if I were actually thinking correctly about this position, and I'm not saying that would happen, but I would think, where can I actually get counterplay? So white's idea is f5, h4, g5. There's no way you're going to stop this. But there is only one idea that could ever give you counterplay. So if you want to pause and try to look for it, be my guest. For those of you too lazy, just continue. And I know I'd probably be in that camp as well. So it's not so much a move as an idea. You can play a5 immediately, but the way I would think about it is maybe I would just do this. So this move looks a little ridiculous, like, Josh, why are you putting rook on a8? But the idea is, okay, let's say f5, bishop f7, and h4. Here, black can play a5. Now, yes, will g5 kill you? Maybe. But in the game, he wasn't so sure that this move was going to end the game. And it would be nice if you try to get at least a rook in, say rook c3 to g3. But now there are some issues. If rook c3, you can play queen takes b4. If pawn takes pawn, for example, you can play rook takes pawn. Next move, I'm playing rook a2, and then I might have some threats. So I'm not saying that this would save the game. First of all, you've traded some pawns, which can usually help. You've opened up the board when white's king's open on g1. So I don't think this should work. I think that white should have ways to take care of this. But the main point is that from black's point of view, from your point of view, it does not matter. Your job is to hang on as best you can, to create counterplay whenever possible, to really find your only ways in the game. Earlier, I said that black should have had the attitude of, well, my position's kind of bad, I'm never going to win, but I need to just hold the fort. I need to get things done. When you have this position, you are never holding this fort. This fort is collapsing. It's under a hurricane, tornado, and cyclone at the same time. This fort is gone. The only way you can hope to survive is to create some form of counterplay, to create an attack, to do something. And whether you play a5 immediately, or you play rook a8, then a5, or whatever you choose, it has to be quick. So I would almost certainly try one of those, and I think that that would be the best play. He plays queen c6, which is a logical enough move, hitting the pawn, but of course white plays f5 anyway, and then h4. And now you look and you go, wait a second, what did queen c6 do? What it did was it lost time. There is no counterplay to be had with queen c6. Even if you play a move like b6. First of all, maybe you can take it in a lot of situations, but you can just ignore it. It does nothing. You know, trying to come in on the b file is not going to happen. It's just way too slow. So this position is already kind of a mess. And honestly, after this, it's, to me, almost resignable. Here, Wesley did, he played a really excellent game. But he did play one of his slight lemons in this position. If he played rook c3, and notice how Carlsen did play rook a8 trying to play a5. He did see that this was the only chance. But now after a5, you can simply play g5 and follow it up with rook g3, and it is likely game over. Wesley played rook c2, which looks similar, but there is a slight issue, which Magnus, to his credit, did see, which is after a5, g5, he plays bishop h5. So the whole point now is that moves like rook g2 run into bishop f3, whereas rook g3 would not. So sometimes it's the subtleties that really get things done. Notice how in the opening we talked about the a3, h3 subtlety. This is another slight subtlety. So Wesley, after the game, was actually quite upset he missed this. And I think computer still gives him winning after something like rook g2, bishop here, b5, or something nuts. But, okay, to play this in a game is actually not so easy. I forget if that's even the right move, or maybe it's b5 first. But the point is that, okay, this is not easy to play. So he plays g6 check, switching gears, which I think is, computers hate it, but I think from a human perspective this makes a lot of sense. Because now this king is awful forever. If you ever open up the board and come into the 7th rank, it's basically toast. So it makes it practically very difficult to play. So I'm not really going to fault Magnus at all for any mistakes made here, but in this position, okay, you have a position like this, you know you're almost certainly losing. So it's easy for people to just let go. And I think, from what I was seeing after the game and what I was seeing as the game was being played, Magnus had given up on his position. He just thought, I'm dead. And he's probably right. But the fact is that as long as you're going to play moves, if you're going to resign, resign. If you're going to play moves, though, put in a little bit of time and think, okay, what is the most accurate move? Because the move he plays here, regardless of whether it loses compared to the other move, it doesn't matter. It can't be as accurate. So he should play queen d7, with the idea that if white plays queen d5 like he did in the game, he can at least play queen c6. And now you actually threaten. Of course, white doesn't really want to trade, so white would have to go back. And you gain at least a little time. Is it that meaningful? Maybe not. But it at least would give him a fighting chance. Whereas after queen c6, white plays rook b6, queen d5, and now essentially life is over. He played a4, rook g8, covering g7. But after c6, he just resigned, because he can't stop c7, rook b8. This one lone pawn is not going to cause enough grief by itself. So that's pretty much all she wrote. So this is where Magnus decided to call it a day, which is quite understandable. So again, I mean, a world champion losing like this, it's usually quite something. And again, a player of this caliber, they don't make usually that many errors. And he really didn't. If you look at it, his position from the opening was just not great. So you could say that part of how the game was lost, which is what this series is about. How did you lose? Part of it was just he got into an opening situation which wasn't great. And he ended up in a slightly worse position, which certainly doesn't help your cause. But in addition to that, he didn't play with the normal precision which we're kind of used to from him. And part of it, again, I think, for a while, he was so into keeping the position a little messy. Like moves like queen e8, which look kind of attractive, but they're seductive in a bad way, because it looks like you're being tricky and creating counterplay, but honestly, you're really just allowing your opponent to continue expanding. Whereas if he had played bishop g5, kind of accepted his fate, okay, I'm never going to win, but maybe I'm doing okay, I think that maybe he would have held this game. And then later, at the point later, whether he plays rook a8 or not, whether he plays, the accurate queen d7 or not, he might lose this game anyway. It's in all likelihood he will. But he could have at least made Wesley be a little bit more accurate, forced him to show his class. And I'd say those are more minor things. The only other thing I would mention is that I think Carlsen had even talked about this, that when he was playing Wesley, he felt like I couldn't lose. Like, I've either won or drawn, but in no game was I ever in danger, in no game were things ever bad. And I can just tell you that this is always very dangerous. Especially when you're dealing with a player of this caliber, because obviously Wesley is capable of beating anyone, really. But it doesn't matter. It could be a player at your local club who you're 6-0 or 20-0 against. It doesn't matter. You can lose to anyone. And if you ever have that attitude of, I really can't lose to this guy, it's always dangerous. I don't care how good you are. You could be Carlsen, you could be 2100, you could be 1200. Whenever you have the attitude of I can't lose, that's when you're more vulnerable. So making sure you have that right attitude, I think, is also very important. Again, I'm not saying for sure that caused him any grief, but I can tell you from experience that both on the losing side and winning side, even opponents who you completely own or ones who completely own you, bad things can happen. And being accustomed to it and making sure you don't underestimate your opponent, I think, is very important. The only other one I would mention is that when you have an opponent who you think you should beat, sometimes you also make decisions of, well, I want to veer the game away from a draw. I want to keep things complicated. And you can convince yourself you're not making mistakes, you're just keeping tension in the game. But there are times, and we noticed it many times during this game, where he had to accept worse with no counterplay. Well, not no counterplay, but just worse in kind of two-result position. And a player like this, especially playing, fellow almost 2800, he knows that there are plenty of situations he has to do this. But I think that when you're facing someone who you think you are better than, and you think you're beating, and you feel pressure to win, you can end up making those bad calls. So making sure that regardless of opponent, you're trying to play the right moves is very important. It doesn't mean that you can't switch up your openings or try to keep tension more and not, allow the game to simplify as much. But whenever you're really pressing too hard, whenever you're trying to think, I have to beat this person, regardless of what they do, it just makes mistakes more likely. Again, it's hard for me I'm really speculating when I say, what was this guy's mental attitude, and what was this? So I don't want you guys to think I'm in Carlsen's head. If I were in Carlsen's head, I would be a much stronger player. But I can just tell you that these are typical mistakes. I know I've made them. And I think most chess players, at least at some point, have made them. So trying to avoid them in your own games will definitely, cause you to lose a little bit less often. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the game. It was very well played by Wesley. And in the end, it did cost Carlsen the tournament because Fabiano recovered from his early loss to Magnus himself and ended up winning the tournament, whereas after this loss, Magnus really couldn't get on the board after that. He just kept drawing, and he couldn't really recover. So this one loss actually cost him the tournament. So certainly an important game as well as an instructive one. So again, if you like these videos, give them a like on YouTube or on my Facebook page. I encourage you to check them all out. If you haven't seen the first video, definitely check that one out. This one, I also tried to make some improvements. You guys were saying that my video was a little messed up, so I tried to improve it, so please let me know if I succeeded or not. All your comments and stuff like that are welcome. Even though YouTube comments in general are dangerous things, I'm definitely paying attention. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I will see you guys next week.